Good morning. Thanks for being here. Thanks for coming out early this morning. So, as Chad said, my name's Arin, Sime, founder of WebRTC.Ventures, and we specialize in WebRTC application development. I don't come from a telecom background, more from a web development background, but there's not a whole lot of development companies that specialize in doing WebRTC integration or development type of work. So I think that it puts us in a little bit of an interesting position that as people contact us and tell us about what they want to build, it gives us a little bit of insight into the market. And so based on what we've seen in people asking us over the last year, kind of put together some thoughts on where we see things going. This could certainly be biased by the people who happen to call us and some of those responses we get, but I hope you'll find it interesting. So we have a few different categories. First, we're just going to give you a couple of little bit of background on the wholly unscientific data points that I have gathered in here. There are a lot of numbers in here, but there's a lot of subjective stuff in here too, so interpret it as you will. But based on the conversations we have with customers and some of the numbers that we've seen, I'm going to talk a little bit about trends in the use cases for WebRTC development, some of the technology trends, and a little bit of trends in the customers that we see, that we talk to. So given that, again, this is an election year. We're used to seeing a lot of polls, so I want to be very clear, I am not a pollster by any means. The margin of error on these polls would be very high. But nonetheless, I think it's interesting. We've started doing a little bit of an informal survey of other WebRTC developers working on projects, and we're going to post that to the WebRTC Ventures blog, so I welcome you to contribute to that. Larger data set of kind of the leads, people who have contacted us this year, specifically around WebRTC development projects, nearly 200. So that's kind of interesting, those conversations. And then a few statistics from some public research as well. So this is from an IDC research report on video communications platform as a service that's available on the video site. And they make a prediction that currently in 2016, they're predicting about 44 million in revenue on video platform as a service, and over the next 4 years going up to nearly 1.8 billion. So that's a huge growth rate in the next 4 years. And so very interesting. Certainly that makes us very excited about being in this space, and I think there's a lot of interest in this space as a whole. Of the people we've talked to, nearly 60% are working on applications in production or what they self-described as large-scale applications. So certainly there's still a lot of people who are kind of just experimenting, dipping their toes in the water as we were a few years ago. But people are getting more and more serious about this, and there are more and more established applications out there. And it's no surprise, perhaps, that still the biggest challenge to widespread adoption that people list is browser support around Safari and IE. Of course, Edge is not an issue, but many people are still concerned about IE. Mobile support, and just making sure that the quality is high. So asking just, was your application successful that you deployed? Nearly 60% responded yes, which is great for what I would still consider a pretty bleeding edge technology. If you look at industry-wide IT statistics, like the Standish Group has this thing called the Chaos Report that they put out periodically about success rates in projects in general, IT projects in general, and they usually list, I believe it's around 60% success rate of projects that meet their budget timeline and scope, so that is good. So, having said that, let's get to a little more interesting stuff of kind of use cases that we see in people contacting us. We're going to talk a little bit about expert marketplaces, interactive broadcasting, bots, AI, a little more speculative but still interesting, show me applications, and of course meeting tools. So of the people who have reached out to us this year, this is the breakdown of what sort of applications they're looking for, or industries that they're trying to serve. Definitely the largest portion, telehealth. So that's no surprise. One of the Benefits of WebRTC being the encryption and security that's built in, and the peer-to-peer nature makes it a lot more interesting and possible to do HIPAA applications, HIPAA compliant applications. So that's no surprise that a lot of requests are around telehealth. Very closely related to that, just remote expert platforms. So the features that people ask for are very, very similar between these two categories. But in this case, we're not talking about medical professionals, could be lawyers, could be sports coaches, we have people ask for a whole lot of interesting niches to build a video-based experts platform in. About 12% of those requests that have come into us were around broadcasting-related applications, so some sort of, could be interactive broadcast or webinar type of application. More something I'll call more generically just a meeting tool sort of application. Certainly, and if you think about what most of the Hello World applications are with WebRTC, they're a basic video conferencing tool, of course, and certainly a lot of the tutorials still are driven around that, but that's a good sign for the maturity of the market is that's not what people are asking for as much right now. I think there's recognition that there's a lot of great tools out there that are well established already, like a Peer.in. Really interesting talk yesterday. And so if you want to enter that space and you've got an idea, you've got to differentiate yourself somehow. So usually people are coming with some sort of little twist on it, but they're just putting out a general purpose, their tool. There's already a lot of competition for that. You'd have to catch up a lot. Certainly other industries, online education, number of projects that we've done that have something to do with online language translation or language learning courses online is definitely an appealing topic for WebRTC. Social media, telephony integration, of course, very relevant to the people here today, and of course call centers, customer service, that sort of thing. But these four here are the biggest categories of the people reaching out to us. And when we just kind of asked others, what are you using it for, a larger bias towards customer contact applications of some sort and online education. Interesting to note here to me, anyways, is field services being a relatively small percentage there, 10%, and that sort of a field support or field services application, also a relatively small number of the requests that we're receiving right now as a development shop. But that IDC report predicts that being a very large segment in the future, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. So the expert marketplaces are very popular. As I mentioned, this one, Wellbeing Consult, is an Australian startup client of ours. Most of the people asking for this are some sort of a startup with a very specific niche that they're trying to serve. In the case of Wellbeing, it's mental health specialists in Australia that they're targeting first. And of course, telehealth is, I wouldn't recommend trying to do remote surgery through the browser, but it's great for follow-up appointments after a large surgery to reduce readmission rates to hospitals, and also for anything where you need some sort of remote specialist, right? And that's where these expert marketplaces ideas come in very handy with something like Wellbeing. If you need therapy or counseling around a very specific topic and you live in the outback of Australia, it's a little bit hard to find a specialist, but you certainly could in Sydney or Melbourne, but it's going to be hard to get there perhaps, so being able to do that remotely is key. So those sorts of niches where you have that dynamic in play, there's tremendous opportunity, even though I think people are asking for very similar features like these. These are the most common features that we get requests for with any sort of expert marketplace. You're building almost identical services from a technical perspective, but the niche that they're applied to can be very, very different and interesting. So certainly you will want to have a directory of experts in different ways that you can search through that, set up an appointment with them, integrate some form of payment. Payments in telehealth are definitely a hot topic of how they can be reimbursed, and I definitely don't have the answers on that. most people who contact us are willing to do some sort of a payment for these sessions outside of the healthcare system, where it's basically just, $50, put it on your credit card, because it's worth it to you to have this conversation with a specialist, perhaps, or second opinions, that type of thing. And then we could integrate other forms of telephony or SMS in appointment reminders, perhaps. Then the video call itself may or may not have recording involved in it. Of course, text chat, file transfer, sometimes screen sharing, very common request there, and some form of note-taking during that, which in the case of a telehealth application may also involve integration with some other electronic medical record system. So these are the most common requests that we get. I do see in interactive broadcasting having huge potential. This screenshot is from a tool produced by TalkBox that we also worked on called Spotlight, that is an interactive broadcasting tool that's been used by some major sports networks and outlets, where you have it's like a radio call-in show, but video. Woo! You have a host, and you have some sort of an athlete or celebrity, and then you can just watch that live online. But then the cool part is you can click a button to get in line, get on stage with your favorite athlete and gush over them a little bit, and then pull yourself together and ask a question, and then the producer pushes you off stage and brings somebody else on. And I've literally seen what looked like a teenage kid sitting on their bed, kind of gushing over an athlete on one of these shows, asking the question, which is kind of cool. So I think that sort of market, definitely there's tremendous potential still to be tapped into there for all sorts of different segments, be it sports, entertainment, politics, whatever the case may be. And of course, it doesn't show up very well on the screen, but SIP and telephony integration obviously are very important and a key topic for a lot of the sessions in this conference. But tying that into the WebRTC side, companies like Voxbone doing that. This is a screenshot that doesn't show up very well here, but from their click-to-call widget, so doing that sort of integration. Now, this one is a little bit more speculative. No one has called me and asked me to build a bot for them yet, but I think that they will. So this is a pure prediction on my part. But of course, bots and artificial intelligence, natural language understanding are all pretty hot topics right now, and I think it makes a lot of sense that we're going to see this overlap with WebRTC and other comms as well. And the use case here that I think of at least is tomorrow I have an appointment with my doctor perhaps, and perhaps I get an SMS text message reminding me that my appointment is tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Don't forget, be on time. I like breakfast, so my first thought is, ooh, what are we doing in this appointment? Do I get to eat breakfast or not? So I might reply over SMS to the bot, maybe not knowing it's a bot, saying, can I eat breakfast or do I have to fast before this appointment? They check the appointment, they check my medical record and say, oh, you're having blood work done tomorrow. Yes, please don't eat after midnight, etc. Right? And we could go back and forth and ask a few questions, and there may be stuff like that can be completely handled by the bot over text without me knowing that I'm not interacting with a human. The same sort of things I would normally call the receptionist at the office for, at the doctor's office. But then there's a certain point where you may get into trying to give a diagnosis, or I may ask some questions that it's not capable of answering, and so the next step is, well, let's set up an appointment for you, or we have someone on call right now that I can bring you immediately into a video call with, or a phone call, or whatever, and facilitating that from the bot so that it's as seamless a transition as possible, and I may not even realize that I've gone from AI to a real human helping me, right? So this is something this is just a screenshot from one experiment we did with that. And a demo video on YouTube. We also, as part of the TAD hack last week, some developers from our team built another example similar to this that we'll put in a blog post up on our site this week if you want to check that out. But I do think this is a very interesting, although speculative, area for us to consider in the future. So I mentioned we get a relatively small number of field services and field support type of requests now, but this IDC report predicts that in 2020, when you look at that 1.7 billion size market that they're predicting, a breakdown of that into a few rough categories, the 725 some million education, social, and media, and then 704 million these show me applications, which they describe some examples there of field technicians. So someone's installing the doing some electrical work in my house, they run into a problem they can't figure out, so using their mobile application they bring in an expert back from headquarters, show them the situation. The expert at headquarters annotates on the screen and says, cut this wire, don't cut that wire, and then they continue without having to set up a follow-up appointment, right? So it's a very common use case there. Another common use case described is insurance claims, so that I've had a car accident and I call to file the claim. Instead of sending out a claims agent, they simply ask me to take out my phone, walk around the car, take a video of the damage to the car, and send it to them, and the claim is submitted immediately there. So those sorts of applications, we don't see a lot of requests for that now, but this report predicts that being a huge segment of the market in 4 years. So I would expect that over the next couple of years, we'll see that category grow dramatically. Okay, so a few trends around the technology itself. As I mentioned earlier, the browser support being an issue, but really specifically the biggest challenge that people see in their applications right now that they're working on is iOS browser support. So I know we all have discussed that many times, but Apple, if you're listening, please do get to that. And then in addition, having just additional support in Safari. Of course, IE is not going to be supported, but until people are upgrading to Edge, it's still an issue people care about. And quality of service, reliable connections are still definitely important. One thing I think is kind of interesting here is that large majority, nearly 80% of the people that we've asked use WebRTC outside of its sort of pure peer-to-peer form. They're using some form of a media server in the middle, or both peer-to-peer and media servers. And that's probably not a big surprise to us here, but I just think it's kind of interesting because the big selling point of WebRTC, and one of the things got me really excited about it when we first started looking into it and working with it, was the whole peer-to-peer and fully encrypted nature of it. But people are definitely willing to compromise on that sort of guiding principle of WebRTC, if you will, in order to address, primarily to address those performance and quality concerns, especially in group chat. These are not scientific numbers here by any means, but definitely Corinto is very popular media server there, just acquired by Twilio, so interesting to see where that will go. Node.js on the development side, by far the most popular tech stack for building WebRTC web applications, at least. For the native side, for mobile side, of course, you have native iOS and Android applications being built, but a lot of people also looking at trying to do more in the cross-platform JavaScript mobile frameworks, and we've started to use React Native for that ourselves. So a few trends that I see on the technology side, based on the conversations we've had. I've always found it interesting that there's not more use of the data channel. Not that necessarily I have brilliant ideas around how to use it, but I have this feeling that there's so much more potential there than we're tapping into. Vladimir gave a great demo yesterday of the robot control that he's done over the data channel before, and so in IoT there's all sorts of applications that could be taking advantage of the data channel on WebRTC. I think particularly in edge or fog computing scenarios, that could be really interesting to have direct peer-to-peer over the WebRTC data channel communication between nodes on a fog computing architecture talking to each other. But we're at least not seeing a whole lot of requests for those yet. It still seems like we're really just starting to see that intersection. But I do see tremendous potential there of devices that are already streaming live data up to the cloud, but eventually, or rather in some situations, would also benefit from streaming video to go with it, maybe triggered by some data condition. And so I think that seeing more interesting uses of the data channel besides text chat and file transfer is basically going to follow the trend line of that intersection of IoT and WebRTC. As we start to have more IoT devices take advantage of WebRTC, we're going to see a lot more usage of the data channel as well. There is, as some of the earlier numbers showed, definitely still a lot of interesting compatibility concerns across browsers, but I do in sales conversations, people ask about that a lot less often than they used to. I think they more get that at this point and are largely comfortable with it. Much more interested in talking about how do we assure good quality in the video conversation. So I do think that performance is more important than compatibility at this point. And more people who are looking at applications that start with mobile first or maybe even are mobile only. And since I think that's interesting from a technology perspective for us to consider, because WebRTC, is an HTML5 standard really conceived more around the browser initially than mobile devices, so that may affect the platform choices or technology choices that we make in those particular applications. So finally, in the last couple of minutes here, just a couple of quick trends around the customers that we talked to. In general, you definitely see, and this may be a reflection of our growth and maturity as a company more than the market. That's a little bit hard to say. It's, again, biased by the people that we talk to, and we're maturing as a company ourselves. But we do definitely see over the last year a significant increase in the maturity of the questions that people are asking us when they come to us. That it's less about will this work in Internet Explorer and more about how can I make it work in this scenario under this bandwidth, et cetera. So there's a definite maturity of our clients and of what their users are expecting, with performance being the biggest thing. But the majority of the people that are doing this still are on the startup side of things. But I do think that there are more enterprises getting into this, and many of you work with them as well. This Forrester research study that called out over 60% of the business executives that they talk to implementing some form of WebRTC in the next year. So I think that as the technology has matured, certainly we'll see that more commonplace in larger companies, and from our perspective, in terms of the people we talk to, we're seeing that trend as well in terms of people, for example, asking for more telephony type of integrations. But there is still definitely an interesting perhaps mismatch in the budgets. Of course, the enterprises are more accustomed to a larger budget than WebRTC necessarily requires, which is fine. That allows them to address the bigger concerns that they often have around an implementation. But I think if you look, maybe this applies more to the startup world, but I think there's a bit of a mismatch. Maybe this is just biased as a service provider myself, my opinion here. But I think a bit of a mismatch between what people think a WebRTC implementation will take based on the tutorials that they've seen versus what they're willing to pay to have at least have someone else build it. And a large number of people who reach out to us have very small budgets in mind, and they're really thinking that I saw this cool Hello World tutorial. Can you make it work in my app? But by the way, I also want all these other things with it of features around it, and it's got to have awesome performance, and it's got to have awesome compatibility. So they don't realize that there's a big gap between kind of the Hello World and then more of a production class, enterprise class application that they want. So, in that sense, maybe we oversell how easy WebRTC is, or maybe I'm just biased as a service provider in that. But we do see that regularly. But in our conversations with more on the enterprise side, they definitely care a lot more about graceful degradation and error conditions, automated testing, compliance, and telephony integration. And again, I think that's a general sign of maturity of the market. So that wraps up my talk. Again, if you want to throw in your voice on that survey, I'd love to have it. We'll post that to our blog, and I'm here at one of the tables today and tomorrow morning too, and happy to talk with you more as well. So thanks.
Thanks, Arin. Do we have about 2 minutes? Do we have time for anybody have any questions?
Hi, Jack Kozik from Nokia. So how do you handle the client that wants something to work on a browser, on a tablet that doesn't have a WebRTC browser? You simply build things native, in that native category? Or
Yeah.
are clients saying, no, never mind, we don't want you to do it in WebRTC, just want you to do it?
So that does depend on the application, but generally speaking, my advice is, unless your use case demands mobile first, then I usually tell people let's start with the web, especially when we're talking with a startup or someone with a limited budget, and say, until you've proven your business model and your customer's desire for this thing that you want to build, let's start with just web. And sorry, iOS users, but as soon as you've kind of proven that there's some traction in what you're trying to do, then we'll go to a native iOS application. But because that may, depends of course on the project, but that may double or at least add a significant amount of money to the investment that they need to make with us to build it, I'll say, in the interest of your best interests, let's just do web first, and then we'll move to native iOS. If we're really lucky, Safari will have it by then, but probably not.
Dean?
Yeah.
Leaving aside my skepticism about IDC's 4-digit accuracy forecasts, it's notable that study was done for video,
Right.
Which is primarily non-WebRTC.
Right.
What use case do you see that sort of WebRTC versus other distinction becoming more important?
Yeah, to me, I see that primarily on the mobile side for applications that have a heavy emphasis on mobile or are mobile only, because that's where I believe providers like Video and Agora can do some extra optimization and tweaking of things themselves and maybe perform a better or different experience. And so if your users are going to be in the mobile context anyways, that seems to make the most sense to me.
All right. Thanks, Arin.
Great. Thank you.